all these tools should be in service of you having good conversations with the appropriate people. So it's like if you're, if you go back to the construction industry, if that's a vertical that you're good at, you have product market fit there, you can sell there. It's like, and then you want to send an email blast out to restaurants, like, well, you probably should fail,
Welcome to the Full Funnel Freedom Podcast. If you are listening to this, you are likely leading a team responsible for generating revenue. Purpose of Full Funnel Freedom is to support people like yourself and keep your funnels consistently, reliably full. Welcome to the Full Funnel Freedom Podcast. I'm your host, Hamish Knox. Today, I am delighted to have Joel Stevenson as my guest. Joel is the VP of Growth at Vendasta, which acquired Yesware in 2022, where Joel was the CEO. Prior to Yesware, Joel built Wayfair's B2B business from scratch to $400 million in annual revenue. He also ran Wayfair's UK business and oversaw the FP&A function as Wayfair transitioned into a publicly traded company. Prior to Wayfair, Joel worked as a consultant at ZS Associates and spent the early part of his career in a variety of sales roles. Joel has an MBA from Yale, attended the University of Illinois for undergrad, and has a goal of being number one for humor endorsements on LinkedIn. Joel, welcome to Full Funnel Freedom.
Great to be here.
So I've given the audience the 30,000 foot view of who you are and what you're doing. Take us down a level. Tell us the story of Joel and fill in the details on how you got from where you started to where you are today.
Yeah, well, I started my career in sales. That wasn't really my plan. I was studying finance in my undergrad, and then I saw this guy speak. It's sort of a well-known entrepreneur, and he sort of made this comment that, like, well, whatever your job is, you're in sales at some level, and it's a good skill to pick up. So I just said, well, let me just try to pick that up early in my career. So I ended up working at a company called GTE, which was later bought by Verizon. It was a big Bell operating, sort of a regional. It wasn't a Bell operating company. It was a regional telecom in the U.S. and they had a really good sales training program, and so I did that, and then I ended up getting hired by one of my customers, and sort of got swept up in the original .com wave. Did a bunch of different jobs there, and then there was a .com bust that many people remember, and then 9/11 happened, and found myself not working for a period of time. Decided to go back and get my MBA and kind of reinvent myself as more of a quantitative person, and so did that, and then did consulting right out of school, and then it sort of got bit by the startup bug again. Went back to supply chain startup, and then that eventually led me to this company called CSN Stores, which was sort of this interesting e-commerce retailer, which we later renamed to Wayfair, which a lot of people know about, and had a great run there for 7.5 years. And the most fun thing I did was we started this B2B business when I was actually doing a different job as kind of an unsanctioned side project, and then eventually went back to that once it got scale, and we grew it to be a big part of the company. It's quite a big part of it now, and that was great. And that, I think what ended up happening there was we just saw that sales technology can really make a big difference in sales productivity, and that was a lot of the way that we generated the growth that we did was through process and tech and good practices. And so eventually Wayfair got too big for me, and I wanted to do something different. We had an investor in common between Wayfair and Yesware, and my main career rule is only work at companies that rhyme. So Yesware was a good fit in that sense. And so I ended up moving over there, and I became a sort of a seller of sales tech versus a buyer of sales tech. And it's been great. And Yesware was acquired by Vendasta a year ago, and so now getting familiar with the Silicon Prairies of Canada, and working inside of a new organization.
Very cool. And yes, Wayfair makes shopping easy. I think that's how it goes. And I certainly have experienced that. So yes, great organization. I'm very curious to know more about sales tech, because I've had many conversations with CEOs and business owners, entrepreneurs that I support, and the conversation goes in a couple of different directions. So direction number one is, yes, sales tech, sales productivity, we totally get it. And on the other side, it's like, Yeah, I got this Frankenstack of stuff that my people begged me for that they don't really use. And, I don't know why I'm paying for all this stuff. So let's unpack both of those conversations. Maybe start on the more positive side of how does sales tech, from your perspective, actually support sales productivity and actually keeping the funnel full on a consistent, regular basis?
Yeah. Well, to me, the simplest thing that technology can do is save you time and prevent you from doing repetitive activities that you could do simply otherwise. And so that's where a lot of people start, I think, is like, well, for example, if you're manually logging tasks into your CRM from email and that sort of stuff, like that should all be done automatically. You shouldn't waste your time doing that.
Sure.
If you're sending the same email over and over again, like you shouldn't do that. You should send a template. If you're sending a series of communications out and you've got it written on a piece of paper and you might forget to send the third one out, or you have a more complicated set of logic that, do this if that happens, and you're tracking all that stuff manually, like it's pretty difficult to do, especially if you're, I think, we normally, at least in our world, we normally think about salespeople that are handling reasonably complicated things can sort of maybe can sort of pursue 30 to 50 at a time, and maybe a lesser number of highly qualified ones. So that's a lot to keep track of. And so I think many people start with the time savings, and then once you sort of achieve the time savings, then the next thing that you hopefully achieve is you achieve an information advantage. And so now you start to know things that you didn't know before, like, for example, who's opening your emails, or who's engaging with your content, what types of content works better to achieve a particular objective, like advancing somebody in a sales process or booking a meeting, or all that stuff starts to become available to you. And so now, armed with that information, you can now apply your time in smarter ways, whether it's maybe ignoring prospects that are not are not showing any interest, or spending more time with the ones that are, or generally doing things that achieve better results versus the ones that don't achieve results. That's kind of level 2. And then level 3 is for, if you're working in a sales organization, is then starting to share those learnings across a team. And so if you've got somebody that's figured out, oh, well, actually I get somebody to a demonstration a much higher percentage of the time when I send this white paper immediately after talking to the prospect versus 3 days later, or instead of sending this other thing or sending nothing, then now that gets shared across your team. Now everybody can take advantage of that benefit, and now your whole sales funnel is in theory gotten better. And so that's typically how people progress with it. There's obviously all these tools have their pluses and minuses where you can sort of use them for evil or good, which we could talk more about, but that's sort of the bull case for sales tech, in my view, is that one.
So that totally makes sense to me. And yes, we are going to touch on good and evil, because that is something that comes up in my conversations. The one thing that I am curious about is this idea of human to human, right? So I love templates. I get the idea of saving time and all that. And there's a portion of our audience of sales leaders right now who are screaming at the speaker, but what about the human being? So how do we not go so far on the extreme that we're sending out good morning name, and on the other side, we're not killing our salespeople's time because we're basically doing bespoke for something that is essentially the same over and over again?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the first thing I'd say is, I think the highest and best use of a salesperson's time is talking to a customer and understanding what their needs are and how your product or solution can help solve a business challenge. So it's all all tech is just a means to that end. Ideally, is that you put salespeople in position to have those types of conversations. Otherwise, why do you need salespeople? Just just do it all with self-service or something.
Absolutely.
So that's kind of my general premise. And then I think the personalization angle is it's a shifting set of constraints, I suppose. So on the one hand, yes, if you spend all your time handwriting everything, you maybe can't achieve the type of volume that you want. On the flip side, if you're just shipping out the same old thing over and over again, good luck getting someone's time and attention, especially now, with AI and other tools that are starting to come into the equation. And so I think, it's going to be different for every business, but I think a couple of tests you could do is, one test is, what's the minimum amount of personalization I need to put into this email so that the recipient realizes that it isn't just a complete complete blast, and and this person has spent no time or attention understanding me or my business. I think that's one test you can apply. And then another test you can apply is like, well, what are the things that are going to be the same about this email no matter who I'm talking to? So it might be, whatever, it's like a little blurb about your company, or it might be, just some filler sentences or words that allow the sort of the scaffolding for you to put the true value in there. I think is another test. And so, your mileage may vary, and I think there's probably a sliding scale where the smaller your buyer universe is, the more personalization you probably need, and the larger your audience is, you could probably get away with a little bit less.
That's fair. I like that, because ultimately there are things that will always remain the same. They'll always, and especially if we're talking to a specific buyer persona, probably the pain points are going to be the same. If we're speaking to, VPs of operations in the construction industry, they're probably going to be the same. So I love that idea of what's the minimum amount of personalization to make it seem like a real human being spent time on this email versus, just a complete copy paste repeat blast out there. Speaking of AI, because AI has, of course, blown up in the last, 18 months or so, and made things like hyper personalization, et cetera, a lot easier. What have you noticed in terms of taking sales tech and then layering on AI to, again, support sellers in saving time while creating more personalization?
Yeah, there's a few ways that we've started to see this work. I mean, I think in one way it can maybe reduce the amount of time that you need to spend researching somebody's LinkedIn profile. There's like any number of tools that, we have one that we've got in sort of a beta where you can kind of scrape somebody's LinkedIn profile and it'll kind of tell you some stuff about them. So, I don't know that you necessarily want to, put that unaltered into the email, but it gives you sort of a starting point for that. So that's one thing that we're seeing. I mean, I think another thing that we're seeing is, to the extent that you're trying to do A/B like testing in your sales communications, and you wanted to very quickly generate 4 or 5 different ways of saying the same thing, AI is great for that. And so you can put some things out there. I think the part of the challenge with that though is, and I think people have started to pick up on this now that particularly a few of the large language models have gotten pretty popular, is that they almost have their own style, if you will. And there's ways through prompt engineering that you can get it to change a little bit. But to the basic user, it's sometimes I think people are starting to recognize things as like being said by ChatGPT or Llama or one of these other big ones. So your average buyer probably doesn't pick up on that today. But to the extent that everybody starts using these tools, it's like everything else. It's like it's good when a small number of people do the particular tactic, but when it becomes a mainstream tactic, it tends to not work so well.
Free offer for listeners of the Full Funnel Freedom podcast. I've got a report called 3 Ways to Ensure Your Sales Cycle Doesn't Sputter in the Last Mile. You can get that at www.fullfunnelfreedom.com/sputter. It's incredibly frustrating as sales leaders when our sellers get a deal almost across the finish line, but can't quite push it to the finish, even though they've promised us that it's coming in real soon. So go get your free report, 3 Ways to Ensure Your Sales Cycle Does Not Sputter in the Last Mile at fullfunnelfreedom.com/sputter. Now back to the show. Okay, so Joel, let's talk about good and evil, because I'm excited to hear your thoughts on how can this be used for good? How can this be used for evil? And how do we prevent our sellers as sales leaders from going to the dark side?
Yeah. Well, to me, as I said, all these tools should be in service of you having good conversations with the appropriate people. So it's like if you're go back to the construction industry, if that's a vertical that you're good at, you have product market fit there, you can sell there. It's like, and then you want to send an email blast out to restaurants, like, well, you probably should fail, at that. And a lot of times what we see happen in email, I think there's this phenomenon that happens where, let's say I blast out 10,000 emails to somebody. It takes me 30 minutes, whatever. I buy a list. I just chuck it in with some boilerplate stuff. Let's say I get one response back, and maybe let's say I can book a demo off of that, and a demo maybe I'm selling something expensive, might be worth, on average $5,000 based on my close rate, whatever. Like, oh man, like, 30 minutes and I got a demo that's worth $5,000 to me. That's great. So it's easy to see the positive signs, but it's much more difficult to see the negative signs. And so it could be that you got one demo, but you actually pissed off 999 or 9,999 other people, or you had a bunch of people mark you as spam. And there's a lot of downstream impacts of this. And I think you see this with reps sometimes, where like you'll get a short-term bump in productivity, but then it very quickly goes away. And I see it with sales leaders too, where it's like you can sort of watch people's LinkedIn. We have a little bit of an advantage here because we sort of know the tactics that people are employing based on the data that comes through. But you can sort of see some of these leaders show up and like they're there for a year and a half, like clockwork, because it's like you do the scorched earth, and that produces results for a period of time, and then you get diminishing returns on that very quickly, and then you're sort of out of tactics at that point. And so what I encourage people to do is, I think you gotta recognize that whatever your buyer universe is, it's precious, and you want to treat it the right way. And there's a long game to selling, and it takes a while to build up pipeline. And when you're busy with pipeline, you still got to build up pipeline. And I think if you're really delivering value and you're trying to we used to have actually a tagline at Yesware called adding value with every exchange. Like if you can really kind of get yourself into that mindset, then I think you're much less likely to go down there are no consequences to me spamming the world. And actually, Google and Yahoo just announced that they're actually tightening up their parameters for spam across a number of companies. And so, I don't know what took them so long to do that, but I think people are going to find it, more and more difficult to just take the easy way out on this stuff.
Very fair. I was listening to a podcast recently, and the guest was talking about Steve Martin, who most people know, comedian, actor, et cetera, and how he decided he was going to live his life in decades. And so in my 20s, I'm going to master comedy. In my 30s, I'm going to master acting, et cetera, et cetera. And when you take that long-term view, like you were sharing, it changes the choices that we make. Because if I'm a sales leader and I'm at a startup and I'm like, you know what? Within 12 to 18 months, I'm going to be on to my next thing. Well, yeah, you're probably going to make some sort of scorched earth decisions that will eventually catch up to you. Because as much as we are 7-8 billion people in the world, we are a small community, and we are selling to a niche, and that niche has a long memory. And if we screw things up on the front end, they're going to hit us on the back end. So I love this idea of adding value with every interaction that you shared with us. So Joel, let's flip over to the other side of that conversation. So we've done how sales tech is good and what it can do and how to avoid going to the dark side. Then there's this conversation around, listen, my sellers just whined for a bunch of stuff, and I've got this Frankenstack, and I don't know what the hell I'm doing with it. So how as a sales leader can we avoid getting into that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think this happens to almost everybody, even to tech companies. I think we're often the worst offenders at this, because we think software is going to solve everything when oftentimes it doesn't. I think part of what you've got to do is you've got to sort of look at, are there any pieces of your stack that are actually adding value, that are working for folks? And, maybe you can find some things that are working and ask yourself, well, why is this working and other things are not working? There's various reasons why things don't get adopted. Sometimes they were never rolled out correctly. Sometimes, training, there was no training or enablement, whether you have an internal function that does that or you work with a vendor to do it. Sometimes you get a bunch of turnover, and it may be that the people that bought that tool and believed in it aren't there anymore. And now there's no champion for the tool and no one that sort of cares about it. You can have interoperability problems where certain tech doesn't play nicely in the sandbox with other tech. I think that one is actually becoming much less of a problem because there's all these sort of middleware tools that are very good at connecting things. And sort of the modern way of doing stuff is to get everything into a data lake and then trying to figure out what's going on from there versus using individual tools and their various reporting to kind of figure out what's going on. But those are some of the reasons. I mean, I think the other thing that can happen to people is, especially sales leaders, is there's this thing that goes on where sometimes I think sales leaders abdicate their responsibility for
Mm.
analytics and understanding the technology. And so what ends up happening is that you bring in an ops person and you basically have no idea what's going on. You just tell the ops person, like, I don't know, like just take care of it, like buy Salesforce or whatever. I don't care.
Figure it out.
And yeah, and what ends up happening is like what I like to call the sales ops industrial complex, which is basically you end up the sales ops people end up building more and more complexity inside of their systems because they
Mm.
find it interesting and it makes sense to them. And so you end up
Mhm.
with Salesforce instances that have like tens of thousands of lines of Apex code. You have all these crazy integrations that may or may not make sense. You've got all this custom reporting that sort of takes time to build up. And it's job security for sure,
Of course.
and and it makes for kind of interesting work, but it doesn't necessarily produce good outcomes. And then there's a
Mm.
real overhead to carrying that. I had this executive coach for a long time, this guy Jerry Colonna, who's a great guy, has written a couple
Mm.
of books, and he has this saying, which is like, how are you complicit in creating the conditions that you say you don't want? And so I think as a sales leader, you got to kind of also look at yourself in the mirror and say, like, well, what was my role in this? Like,
Yeah.
how did we get here? And how can I prevent that from happening again? Because this is a very common refrain of people that buy tech and then don't use it. So
Mhm.
and I think a lot of SaaS companies are on the losing side of this right now. As a lot of people are
Mhm.
taking a hard look in the mirror, and if you look at some of the quarterly results that are coming out, particularly in the sales and marketing area, they're not so good lately.
Very true. I love that phrase of the sales operations industrial complex, because ultimately we have to prove our value, right? Or we have to prove why are we still employed. And it's like the junior executive in Hollywood who makes a note on a script, just because if they don't put a note on there, it's like, why are you there? Like, we can free up your salary. You're clearly not providing anything. And usually what they're providing is not helpful. And in this case of like all these Salesforce integrations or whatever CRM you're using, probably not helpful. It keeps justifying the sales ops role in that organization. So I love this idea of not abdicating and asking yourself, what role did I play? Because I know I said that to some of my vendors, is you need to force me to use this tech because I'm the guy who will buy the shiny thing. And then 6 months later be like, why did I buy that? Like, why do I have reminders popping up? So as
Yeah.
we're wrapping up, Joel, I'm curious if you could go back and coach younger Joel, because you've had a awesome career, lots of varied experiences. I imagine you have a lot of bumps and bruises and some scar tissue that you are carrying with you.
Mhm.
If you could go back and coach younger Joel and say, hey, younger Joel, you're going to end up over here. Here's how you can get there with fewer bumps and bruises and less scar tissue. What would you coach younger Joel to say or do differently?
Yeah. Um, I think there was a period in my time earlier where I think I just sort of felt like I was talented enough to just make it. And I had a relatively easy time through school, and
Mm.
a lot of things came relatively easy for me. And I think I just got outworked by a
Mm.
bunch of people. And um, there's I forget who wrote it. Maybe this I want to say Jim Citron. This book, Talent is Overrated,
Yes, I know
where
this
he sort
book.
of talks about like that. I think it's in some of like the same as the Malcolm Gladwell, like 10,000 hours to be an expert,
Mm-hmm.
like some of that kind of stuff. And I don't know. I think I could have worked harder earlier in my career. And the other thing about that is it's like those benefits compound. And so if you
Mm-hmm.
get, if you're really working hard and learning in your 20s, that pays off in your 30s and 40s and 50, over a long period of time. So I think I figured that out a little bit later than I would have liked to have
Mm-hmm.
figured it out. And I certainly encourage people to think about, putting in the work and practicing, and not only just practicing, but sort of practicing the right way.
Mm.
Are really important.
What an incredible answer. Yeah, I love that idea of, yeah, if I could have learned earlier, then I would be accelerating. So Joel, you've mentioned a couple of books already. You've mentioned, you worked with an executive coach who wrote a couple of books. What are some books, podcasts, videos that you would encourage our audience to check out to further their own learning and development that have been beneficial to you in your career?
Yeah, I could mention a few. I mean, Jerry's book I mentioned is called Reboot. He actually just put out a new one, which I have sitting here, but I've not read yet, called Reunion. So I'm guessing it's going to be good, but I can't say. I've always been a big proponent of David Allen's Getting Things Done. I think in some ways that's the best sales book ever written. I'm also a big fan of spin selling from the early days. So those are a few in the sort of that specific realm. And then, for podcasts, I think an interesting one on the leadership side is you got to kind of dig for this one, but you can find it on YouTube if you look up The Smell of the Place. There was he's passed now as a Wharton professor. I'm going to butcher his name, Subramanian Gosal, I believe is the name. Anyway, somebody turned me on to that, and it's a lot about culture and how do you create the right culture inside your organization. It's about 20 minutes. It's one of the most effective discussions of culture and how it manifests and how you can sort of understand it that I've ever heard. So I always recommend that one.
The Smell of the Place. That sounds fascinating. Well, we'll link to all of those in the show notes, and I'm certainly going to check those out as well. So, Joel, you and I could chat all day, and I've been a guest on your podcast as well. So thank you for that opportunity. I have one last question for you to wrap up. You've already given us such amazing insights and wisdom. What is a closing thought, another bit of wisdom you'd like to share with the audience, or maybe you have something to plug? The floor is yours.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time to be in sales and sales leadership. We at Yesware, we've been writing about sales topics for a better part of a decade, very data driven. You can find all that stuff at yesware.com/blog. And if you want to check out our episode of The Hard Sell, you can do that at yesware.com/podcast. And you can find me on LinkedIn.
Very cool. Well, Joel, I look forward to carrying on our conversation offline. Thank you for being a guest on Full Funnel Freedom today.
Thanks for having me.
Sales leaders, what an amazing conversation with Joel. I shared with him after we stopped recording that I really sat up straighter when he said, how are you as a leader complicit in the situation that you've caused that you're complaining about? Because when we recorded this episode, I was in the middle of a situation with my calendar where I had overbooked myself. I was completely complicit in that. So I have made corrections to that. And so now my calendar is much more under my control, and I don't feel as anxious as I did back when we recorded this episode. Few other takeaways that really stood out to me from Joel's conversation. I'd love to hear what your takeaways were on the social media where you find this episode. The number one thing was how to avoid being evil with our sales tech, and how playing the long game is a much better focus than getting these short-term quick wins that are probably burning a bunch of bridges that we're not even going to know about until we attempt to reconnect with that individual who we burned the bridge with, and they either never contact us or never engage with us, or they come back and they punch us right in the mouth because we upset them whenever it was the last time that we talked to them. The other thing that I really appreciated Joel saying is, what role do we as sales leaders play in the Frankenstack that we created or that we have inherited, and really interrogating what use does this have in supporting my sellers in being more productive. And the last big takeaway for me was, as much as we want to enhance productivity, we ultimately want to get our sellers to have a real human-to-human conversation with a buyer. And if we're using sales tech in a way that just makes us sound like everybody else, we're not going to get to that mountaintop. So yes, sales tech is great, and it's also potentially detrimental in getting our sellers to connect with buyers if we're not differentiating on how we sell, not what we sell. Again, love to hear your takeaways in the comments on our social media. Thank you for supporting the Full Funnel Freedom podcast. And until we connect on the next episode, go create Full Funnel Freedom. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the Full Funnel Freedom podcast. You can continue to support us by leaving us a review and a rating, sharing this episode with a couple of sales leaders in your network who you care about. I'd love to connect with you. I'm easy to find, Hamish Knox on LinkedIn. Also, if you'd like a free 15-minute call with me, go to www.hamish.sandler.com/how-to-sandler. Until we connect on the next episode, go create full funnel freedom.